Hello, BookTube. Well, we've come to it at last, our final chapter of our read-along of Can You Forgive Steve Donoghue? Can You Forgive Her? By Anthony Trollope. The first of his Palliser novels, a great long novel about three women who face different but parallel problems about what to do about passion, marriage, money, independence. And we have followed this for a good long time now. I've had a great deal of fun, and this last week I've needed it. So it's been a great escape for me, which I'll mention a little bit later on. But when the reading that we're doing today commences, the plot of the novel is in full boil. George Vavasor, the cousin of our heroine Alice Vavasor, the she, the her of the title, has been broken. His brain has been broken by reverses that he has experienced. He's physically attacked his sister Kate. He's been savage with his alleged fiancée Alice. And despite all that, he decides to dun Alice for yet more money, for a huge amount of money, in order to try to win the next election in the seat that he just barely won the last time. And she agrees. He sends an emissary to her house, and she agrees to pay the money if only she has to have nothing more to do with him. And this alarms her mild, diffident father is alarmed by this because her money's her own, but he thinks there's no end to George Vavasor's greed, and he's probably right. But John Gray, Alice Vavasor's previous and extremely virtuous fiancé, pays the bills. Just as a matter of course, says, let the man have his plunder. And at the same time, one of the other women, Aunt Greenough, is faced with the prospect of choosing between two suitors, both of which have been played for comedy so far throughout the book that a reader could be excused for saying, why does she need to pick either one of these people? There's the oafish, prosperous farmer, Mr. Cheeseacre, and the raffish, good-for-nothing spendthrift ex-captain Belfield. And both are full of flaws and shortcomings and don't have much in the way of things to recommend them, especially not to someone like Aunt Greenough, who underneath her fluttering widow's weeds and underneath her sort of busybodyish exterior is a very likable and deep woman. It seems like with a mild amount more exertion she could find a suitor more to her taste. But we learn different in the course of these chapters. Reading it again, I absolutely loved learning different all over again. And the third woman is Lady Glencora Palliser, who was the focal point of the last chapters. She had a previous lover, Burgo Fitzgerald, a total wastrel of a man, useless in any way whatsoever. And her family and the Palliser family worked pressure on her to make her marry Plantagenet Palliser, the heir of the Duke of Omnium, so that Burgo Fitzgerald wouldn't spend all of her money and bring her entire name and her family into disgrace. And it worked. Glencora, despite being stronger-willed than, arguably speaking, either of the other women in the book, yields and marries a man she doesn't love. And at the climax of the chapters that we just finished, she goes to Lady Monk's party. Lady Monk is a vicious busybody, the dark mirror image of Aunt Greenough, and waltzes extravagantly with Burgo Fitzgerald, and hears him say that he wants to go away with her, and adamantly refuses him and is taken away from the party by her husband, who decides, despite the fact that he is a rising star in the government and likely to be the next Chancellor of the Exchequer, that he will abandon his political career and take himself and his wife on a tour of Europe. And he does that. And Lady Glencora urges Alice Vavasor to go along, to be her companion. And in the traveling chapters that we get at the beginning of the chapters that we're reading this time around, the thing that struck me that hadn't struck me before is how excruciatingly awful those first few weeks are for Alice. Because Plantagenet Palliser has nothing but good intentions. he wants to show his devotion to his wife in the galumphing, ham-handed way that is the only way he knows. He's socially inept in the furthest extreme. But his wife is resentful on some levels that she can't even articulate, and is a petulant monster during those first weeks, constantly putting up pettish objections, constantly mocking her husband, even openly over the breakfast table in front of Alice, to the point where Plantagenet Palliser actually has to apologize, and Glencora, knowing perfectly well why, wonders airily and loudly why he's apologizing. I'd forgotten how excruciating that all is. And while they're traveling, they are met in their travels by John Grey, who has come to Europe specifically to find Alice. He made no bones about this. It's not that he's jumping out of the shrubbery to surprise her. He told her that he would come and find her. And he gets along well. Not only with Lady Glencora, who gets along with lots of people, but also, surprisingly, with Plantagenet Palliser, who is, to put it mildly, not given to friendship. They become friends. No doubt about it. In fact, Palliser even comes close to joking, to bantering. So the party actually manages to be having a good time while they're traveling. And with only one dark exception, there's one moment where Lady Glencora impulsively wants to visit the gambling tables, the gambling dens at Lucerne, which is where no proper woman should ever be seen, and actually sits at the table and gambles until her husband finds her. Alice finds her and is horrified, tries to bring her away, but can't. Her husband then finds them both and is furious with both Lady Glencora and Alice for being seen in such a den of iniquity. But it blows over, and they keep traveling, and John Grey is with them. And the whole time that that's happening, George Vavasor is having one disappointment after another back in London. The main one being that he fails in his bid to re-enter Parliament. And all of that money is gone. He has only a tiny amount of, a relatively small amount of it left. And he doesn't see any way out for himself, and idly contemplates for the source of, for the course of a whole chapter, killing himself, blowing his brains out. And during that chapter, we meet someone comes to his rooms, a young woman, a 30-year-old woman, who is poor and distressed and obviously knows him quite well. And this is when we're first introduced to George Vavasor, chapters and chapters and chapters ago, we're told that he has a place in the country where he keeps hunting horses, and that he has a place in London where no one ever visits, and that he has a third place. And I believe that's the third place. That all along, in addition to all the other monstrous behaviors, he's been stringing at least one other woman along. We don't learn much about her, and he does nothing for her, but eventually decides to leave London, to leave England, to go to America, take ship to America, and just change his name. But before he does that, he decides to pack a gun in his pocket, go to visit John Grey, who is at the moment in London, and abuse him, challenge him to a fight. And he does, and Grey, of course, says, "You're insane, I'm not going to fight with you." and George Vavasor shoots at him, misses, and then flees. So there's no way that he could be back in England. In fact, the Scotland Yard detectives that John Grey very discreetly consults are angry that they've missed their chance to nab this guy. They would have been willing to go to America to hunt for him, but John Grey will hear nothing of it. But the main plot line involves John Grey in Europe later on. I mean, there are things that take place earlier in these chapters, including one last nefarious effort by Lady Monk to finance Burgo Fitzgerald's running away with Glencora Palliser. Before they leave London, she orchestrates everything for one last try, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work, not just because Alice Vavasor is there as a sort of a source of moral support, but also because Lady Glencora has learned her lesson. She's come to her senses. She's not going to do it, even if she wants to. And when Burgo Fitzgerald sees that, he slinks off. And we think we're done with him. But when the family is traveling in Europe, several thunderbolts fall all at once, and Trollope orchestrates them perfectly. Plantagenet Palliser gets a note from London saying that there's been a rift in the current government, and that there's a chance for him to re-enter politics. There's a chance for him to be Chancellor of the Exchequer. After all, if he will only cut short this insane year-long European holiday and come back to London. At the same time, Lady Glencora informs him that she's pregnant. A lack that they have both felt in their relationship, and that these chapters make clear has driven them further apart than we thought. As Plantagenet Palliser haltingly tries to make clear to John Grey in one of their conversations, it means ever so much more for a Duke of Omnium to have an heir. For the heir of the Duke to have an heir of his own means more. That, of course, having a child is a happy occasion for anyone, but John Grey doesn't seem quite to buy it. And I think when he responds by saying, well, yes, when so much more is riding on it, of course, would be so much more important, I think he's being as close as he can to sarcastic. But the third thunderbolt happens when they return to Lucerne. Lady Glencora now feels she knows her husband much better than she did before. I think she likes him more than she did before. Certainly Alice likes him more. He and Alice are friends. And Lady Glencora wants to go back to the gambling tables. Just to see. That's all. And to go with her husband this time, so that he knows there's no danger, there's no nothing like that. And he admits he's interested too, to see what kind of people go there and gamble with other people's money and win other people's money. And when they're at the gambling tables, who do you think they see? Gambling away his last penny, Burgo Fitzgerald, who loses a massive sum of money, so much so, loses everything, so much so, so dramatically that everyone at the tables just sort of stares at him. And the proprietor of the hotel's agent stares at him because they all know perfectly well that young men who lose that much sometimes kill themselves. And Burgo wanders off into the hills. And Glencora Palliser is urgent with her husband, pushes him and says, go and intercede. Help him somehow. Go and help him. You have nothing to worry about. And of course, by this point, he knows he has nothing to worry about, which makes him all the more willing to do it. So he does. He follows Burgo Fitzgerald into the woods. They strike up a conversation. Palliser offers to help him. Burgo Fitzgerald knows perfectly well who he is and says, of all the people in the world, you're the only person I wouldn't borrow money from. But when later on Palliser is presented with Burgo's hotel bill, he pays it. And when they're back in London, he visits Burgo's family and arranges something, makes a little arrangement, a small amount of regular money. It won't be enough. We don't know what happens to Burgo Fitzgerald, but we know that the tiny amount of regular money that he's getting, provided he agrees never to leave the small, uneventful German town where they quarter him, we know that's not going to be good enough. But our narrator firmly tells us he goes out of our story now. We can't keep paying attention to him. Same thing with George Vavasor. He goes out of our story. We can't keep paying attention to him. And instead what we get is classic Trollope. Trollope, in addition to midstream cliffhanger plot twists, and I think in addition to a subtle sort of twinkling humor that runs throughout a lot of his books, a lot more so than a lot of people think, who especially haven't read him. In addition to that, Trollope has an expertise that I don't think is matched anywhere in the world of letters, and that is for the long, slow, comfortable goodbye. His books are forever ending. They end many, many times over in multiple cadences, much like the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings movie, Return of the King, except interestingly. So at the end of this book, of course, we get the marriage, because when they're in Lucerne, in addition to all these other thunderbolts, John Grey makes his case one last time to Alice. I have forgiven you. I don't care about what you did with George Vavasor. I don't call you a jilt. I don't think you jilted me. The rest of the world will quickly forgive you, or has already. The only person who's not forgiving you is you. And you owe it to me to at least try. And somewhat, I think, jokingly, she says, all right, you win. She agrees to be happy. Trollope's descriptions of what she agrees on, of the realizations that she comes to, that she's not, that she suffered because she thought she was better than other girls, and now she knows different, that she needs someone to lead her, and now she knows who it is. I don't know that I buy those. I don't think that's really what's going on here. I think John Grey probably has it a little more accurately when he's talking just about psychological factors. But one way or another, she agrees to marry him. And at Plantagenet Palliser's urging, he agrees to go into politics. He agrees to go into Parliament. So in in rapid and very enjoyable sequence of chapters, we get one good thing happening after another, while one bad thing after another is slowly, gently, but firmly put aside, which is a very signature Trollope thing to do. The villain of the book is ruined and disappeared. The tragedy overhanging one married couple, which is that the wife is not conceiving an heir, is dealt with. The tragedy overhanging another couple, that the woman obstinately refuses to let herself be happy by marrying a man who has always loved her, is dealt with, and so on and so forth, all the way down the line. Aunt Greenough even finds a way to successfully matchmake with Mr. Cheesacre, even though she's chosen Captain Belfield herself, and the choosing of Captain Belfield even has a happy ending, because she admits to Cousin Kate and to Alice that yes, he's a spendthrift, and yes, he's probably a liar, and yes, he will be sort of a lazy dog around the house. He's not exactly a memorable husband, but she likes the dash of romance that he has, the dash of the rocks and valleys of romance that he has, which Cheesacre absolutely does not. And she also likes the idea of managing her husband. Yes, he'll always be short of money, but my money is my own, and I can help him. And I'll help him only so far, and I'll make sure he toes the line. You get the impression that Aunt Greenough knows exactly what she wants and has chosen the man that will give it to her. And I also think, I don't know what your impressions will be, but I thought in these chapters that the more clear she makes it to Captain Belfield what he can and cannot get away with, the better off he comes. He seems a more redeemable character the more tightly he's controlled. And the less he can get away with. So that by the end of the book, we have Plantagenet Palliser as Chancellor of the Exchequer. We have John Grey in Parliament and happily married. We have Glencora Palliser delivering a baby boy, an heir, for Plantagenet Palliser and the House of Omnium. We have everybody happy. Aunt Greenough is even thinking that she might take over the old squire's house at Vavasor. She kind of likes it. She kind of likes the countryside, and maybe go up to London once in a while from there to keep the captain's more adventurous appetites in order. And that's how the book ends. Trollope ends the book by saying, everyone else is forgiven, Alice Vavasor, and I'm hoping you can too, because everything came out all right in the end. And reading it again, I just loved it. I know that's going to be very predictable, but I just thought it was a fantastically masterful performance. I can certainly see how Trollope's publishers would read this manuscript and think, or read the original chapters, or even see the finished work in serial and say, this is worth all the money we can pay. This is a fantastic book. And I can certainly understand why it would be so popular and why Trollope himself would look back on it so fondly. It's just a masterfully done job, not only of introducing us to all of these characters, only a few of which we will actually continue to see for the next 5 books, but also of giving us that slow, comfortable arc that Trollope does so well, where you feel in perfectly competent hands from beginning to end, and a whole bunch of things that about the narrative that don't in any way spoil the page turning quality. Trollope is a steady hand, and he's not interested in cheap effects. Even his comedy with Cheesacre and the piles of manure and whatnot is more textured, I think, than the comedy that you find in most Victorian writers, most Victorian novelists, especially Charles Dickens, who's well known for his comedy. He's praised everywhere for his comedy. People tend to read him not only for his pathos, but for his comedy. And I think he overdoes both, whereas Trollope does not. So I know that puts me in the minority for readers of Victorian literature, but even so, that brings us to the end of this read-along, and I'm dying to know what you all thought. Not only those of you who've read some Trollope before, but maybe especially those of you who haven't. If this is your first Trollope, what did you think? Is there anybody who's been doing this read along who is at the end of this book disappointed? I would love to hear that too, and why. I'd love to know also if your reactions to the different characters changed in the last quarter of the book, because there are some personality changes. I think Plantagenet Palliser is drawn more human. I think that John Gray is drawn more human, especially when he starts to realize that Alice might be able to help him to be less perfect, less sure. The only thing I'm anticipating might have caused problems for 21st century readers is Alice's frequent protestations that the thing she has done now is surrender her votility. The reason that she was finally able to forgive herself is by acknowledging that she's a servant to her husband. I don't think the book actually sustains that. When we see them after she's had those thoughts in the cemetery in Lucerne, we see them as very much a partnership. They're talking to each other. He's not dictating what she should do or not do. So I don't think that Trollope necessarily wants us to believe that, lock, stock, and barrel. But I'm wondering what you believed. I'm wondering what you thought of all of it. And just as one sort of loaded question here, because this is an obvious thing, when you were finished with this book, did you feel like you might want to read more Palliser novels? Because I would very much like to continue reading along in the Palliser series all the way to the end, not necessarily consecutively, but I'd like to get to all of them until we're done, until we've finished The Duke's Children. But one way or another, that's going to wrap it up for now. That is the end of Can You Forgive Steve Donoghue? So my very first full-length formal read-along for BookTube. So let me know all your thoughts, and we'll confer later about the next one. So until then, I'll see you. Thank you, BookTube.